This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin today's show with insight on common law marriages in Kansas. From K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen. Roger highlights several cases of common law marriages resulting in messy court situations with agricultural land, and the 3 things necessary to validate a common law marriage in Kansas specifically. Also ahead, Christy Davis, the USDA State Director for Rural Development, joins us to share information on the USDA's Value-Added Producer Grants. We end today's show with this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. This week, K-State experts Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Bob Larson answer a listener's question on hiring managers on the farm. Should they consider hiring internally or externally? That and more's coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are beginning today's show with our agricultural law update. And of course, as always, we're joined by K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen for that. So Roger, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Samantha.
Absolutely. So today you wanted to talk about common law marriages in Kansas specifically. A messy subject when it comes to ag.
Well, it is. And it's probably one that a lot of people are thinking, what is the relevance here? They're not thinking that there is any relevance to agriculture, but there is, because whether or not you're in a common law marriage is a factual question. And I think there's still a lot of misconceptions out there as to what constitutes a common law marriage. Is it just enough to live with somebody for a long enough period of time and that's it? And that may not be the case. And this is a big deal because you might get the IRS that's involved if it's a large estate. You've got inheritance rights if you are a spouse. You don't have certain rights if you're not a spouse. You don't have spousal rights if you're not a spouse. And the property may go an entirely different direction than what was planned. So you either formalize the marriage with a formal ceremony or you make sure you definitely understand the Kansas rules for what it takes to create a common law marriage. And then there are others in other states that might be listening, or if this gets on your podcast, there are just a handful of states that will recognize common law marriages. Most states don't recognize the concept to begin with.
Wow, that's a huge misconception then, I feel like, among the general public.
Right.
Just, we're common law married kind of thing.
Yeah, and you may not be, and that's the whole point of this. And then you can get involved with lawyers, you end up in the court system, and it's an absolute mess.
Sure, and Kansas specifically, like you said, is one of the states that recognizes common law marriages. But we've got some cases today we want to talk through, example cases where this has happened here in Kansas. And one of them, it's especially sad what's gone on. Right.
One of them was about a decade ago. And this one arose kind of in south central Kansas, and involved a multi-million-dollar farm estate. And the claim was that the couple, which had never been formally married, there was no marriage ceremony. The claim was that she was a spouse, and therefore, because this was a potentially federal taxable estate, there was about $1.4 million at issue that the IRS was asserting had to be paid because they were claiming, that she as a survivor was not a spouse, and therefore he couldn't utilize marital deduction in his estate and leave property to her free of tax, because that's one of the tax issues that's out there in a marital relationship. You can leave all your property to your spouse during life, you can gift it all to your property, or you can leave it all at death or in any amount, and none of it's taxable because there's an unlimited federal estate tax deduction as well as gift tax deduction on that marital property. And the IRS was saying, based on your situation, you weren't married and we want the tax.
Sure. So this case, like you said, it was a while ago, but it took several years to actually come to a conclusion. So what ended up actually happening in that case specifically?
Well, the bottom line, and I'll circle back to the facts here in just a moment, the bottom line was that the trial court on about the third iteration of this did determine that she was a common law wife, and so therefore marital deduction could apply. But it took them a number of years and a number of evidentiary hearings through all of these various court cases, federal and state, because you've got the IRS involved, you're going to be in federal court. You've got some state court issues too. But in Kansas, we have to clear 3 hurdles hurdles to have a valid common law marriage. And one of those is, of course, the parties have to have the capacity to marry. And that means they're of legal age and have the legal capacity to enter into a marital arrangement. And secondly, they have to mutually agree to be presently married. So there has to be some type of agreement. You can't force a common law marriage on someone. There has to be evidence of a present agreement to marry. And then third, the parties have to hold themselves out to the public as husband and wife. Now, that third one is, most people would be familiar with that. That's what most people think. Well, we hold ourselves out to the public. We've done so, and I hear this all the time. 7 years isn't that the time frame? Well, no, not necessarily. You've got to have all of these requirements. The longer, the better, because it gives you more time to prove those elements exist. But in the first case that we're talking about here, initially it was determined that there was no mutual agreement. As we went through the first round of the court cases on this, they couldn't prove a mutual agreement. The only direct evidence of an agreement to marry was her testimony that they had a honeymoon in Hutchinson, and he carried her over the threshold of the door to the hotel. Nothing against Hutchinson, but I don't think it's a destination spot for honeymoons. And that's kind of the way the court viewed this, too. It's like, well, come on. I'm not sure about that. But there was, I think, probably the most damaging evidence by IRS as well as the Kansas Department of Revenue, because, they want their cut out of this, too, of state-level taxes, was that the decedent, the so-called husband that had died, executed his will as a single person and refused to refer to her as his wife. So you've got contradictory evidence, and this is why the courts had to struggle with this one for a number of years. So it goes on appeal, it goes back, it bounces back and forth, federal court, state court. Ultimately, you had a later trial in a federal court on the issue of whether the common law marriage existed, and the jury determined that it had been established. And so she wasn't stuck with over $1 million of tax, but a lot of lawyer fees and a lot of mess because they just had a bunch of misconceptions about what it took.
We said that this was an older case, but these cases are still happening today, really. We had 2 recent cases here in Kansas.
Yeah, 2 more cases within the past 2 weeks, one in the Kansas Supreme Court, one in the Kansas Court of Appeals, and the first one in the Kansas Supreme Court. And the reason you've got to go to the Supreme Court is because the IRS will not accept a lower state court. You have to have the highest state court opinion to validate a common law marriage for purposes of the IRS following it for tax reasons. And so you've got the Kansas Supreme Court taking a look at this, and this couple is asserting that they had a common law marriage based on the facts that they had legal capacity to marry. They said, we've got a mutual agreement to do this, and we conducted ourselves in the public as if we were married. Well, when you peel the onion back on this one, so to speak, they did live together. They paid all their utilities under the same name. They made joint charitable contributions. They had a joint savings account. They owned multiple pieces of real estate together. They listed each other as beneficiaries on IRA accounts. They called each other husband and wife at family events and in social settings. They attended medical appointments as a married couple. They've got some pretty good evidence with respect to that. And they got that ruling from the lower court. They filed an appeal with the Supreme Court to validate it in the eyes of the IRS, and they were able to do that. In another case, it didn't come out that way because the evidence was bad. You had an individual, his mother lived in Kansas. She left him a home. He and his partner lived in Texas. And he went up to Kansas to take care of his mother's estate. When she died, lived in the house that he gave her. And there really was no good evidence that he was treating her as his wife. And in fact, the funny part of this case, maybe funny is not the right word, interesting would be probably a better word, is that he had a girlfriend that was giving money to his son. And his supposed common law wife didn't know about the girlfriend until Mama died. It was a strange one, but needless to say, she did not win that case. She was not deemed to be a common law wife, even though she's arguing, look, we lived together long enough, that should do it. And again, there's that misconception again.
Sure. And I guess that's some of our major takeaway lessons from these cases. Obviously, a success case paired with one that was sort of a success after years and years of dealing with lots of stressful events, and then one that was just altogether a failure. But major takeaways here when it comes to common law marriages in Kansas, what should we really know?
Well, that last case really points it out. You have to have an agreement to be married rather than just simply an agreement that is an intent to be married at some point in the future. Because what she was saying was, well, when he gets back from Kansas, we're going to get married. That's not good enough. You have to have an agreement to be presently married, not an agreement that is an intent to be married. So if you meet those three requirements and you have pretty good evidence and you really conducted everything as if you were a married couple, then we might get there. But the point is, if you're going to do that anyway, just go ahead and formalize it with a ceremony, and it'll eliminate a lot of this confusion.
Sure, create a lot less stress in the long run, and especially when a lot of these circumstances obviously are unforeseen. So definitely insightful here today, Roger. And I know you wrote about this recently in one of your blogs, so if listeners are tuning in and they want to read through maybe some of that information, where can they do that at?
On my website, which is washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, and it's also on AgManager.
Wonderful. Well, I'll link to both of those as well in the show notes of today's show, which, as always, can be found on agtoday.net if you want to check that out further. But, Roger, as always, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen joining us for a discussion on common law marriages in Kansas. If you're listening to us on the radio and are afraid you're going to miss out on our next segment because you're reaching your destination or have something else that you're having to switch to quickly here, don't forget the Agriculture Today programming is also available as a podcast. Our podcast is easily accessible on all podcasting platforms, including our website, agtoday.net, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You can simply search us on any podcasting platform, Agriculture Today, Kansas State, and we are more than likely to pop up, and you can follow us there. That way you can simply have us pop up in your regular feed on whatever platform you're using and listen to us more regularly that way. Once again, you can easily access that on agtoday.net or any podcasting platform by simply searching Agriculture Today, Kansas State. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we're joined now by Christy Davis. She is the USDA Kansas State Director for Rural Development, and she's joining us today to talk about the value-added producer grants that are available to our producers here in Kansas. So, Christy, before we get into things, thanks for joining me today.
Well, it's great to be here again.
Absolutely great to have you again. And like I said, we're going to be discussing these value-added producer grants. So if listeners are tuning in and they're not familiar with these, what are these grants really for?
Yeah, value-added production grants are one of the programs that we have with rural development. So it's different than the programs that FSA has or NRCS. And, we're working on value-added production. So things that enhance the value of the things that folks are growing already. So, for instance, if you're producing grapes, you may decide to produce wine. That's kind of a next step. You're adding value to the product, and it has economic value to rural Kansas communities. So if you have a lavender farm and you want to make soap and oil from the lavender, you're adding value by creating additional product or changing the physical state of the product. So it's any kind of production that enhances the value. And just for some examples, again, I know most of your listeners are very sophisticated when it comes to ag programs, but for those who may not be, there's some great examples of this in Kansas. And just to maybe get people excited about the topic, among them, New Life Market in Scott City. I know a lot of folks have probably heard of that business. They grow and harvest, mill, and package gluten-free sorghum that's used in all different applications. So they grow it, they mill it, they package it, they ship it. So that's the type of project that we have funded in the past. McCarty Farms in Rexford, which is in northwest Kansas, that's a farm that also has a milk condensing plant. So that's another project that we funded in the past. We recently had a notice of funding available that USDA Rural Development will be funding about $31 million in projects nationwide. And so when folks apply for this funding, we'll have funding in Kansas, but it's a nationwide competition for funding for planning grants up to $75,000 or working capital grants up to $250,000. So these are for both production and marketing. You might have a planning grant where you have a project in mind where you're growing strawberries and you're turning them into jam, and you want to see if that's a viable option for you, and you're a small producer. You can apply for grants to do the planning for that, strategic planning. Or working capital. If you want to, create a production line, we have working capital grants up to $250,000. So this program has been around in the past, but this current round of grant money is available for application until May. So if folks are interested in applying in this round, the applications are due in May, and then the projects will be awarded in September. It's likely we'll have, this program in the future, but this is a good time to apply if you have a project that is ready to go.
Absolutely. Yeah. It sounds like obviously a quick deadline here, a turnaround, but that's why we're sharing it on the show. It's a great opportunity we want to share with our listeners to take advantage of. And it sounds like obviously there's a multitude of ways that these grants could be used. Like you listed, something from a strawberry grower wanting to make jams, or even a lavender producer wanting to make oils or take advantage of those sorts of situations. So it really seems like the options are limitless with these grants.
Yeah, I welcome creativity. And as most of your listeners will know, there is a great deal of funding, federal funding out there for farm-related activities through USDA, and also just in general because of the Inflation Reduction Act and other boosts to these programs that help provide relief to communities and businesses, especially in rural communities. So oftentimes, there is a very quick turnaround. Sometimes there will be a notice of funding available and a very short time to apply. In this case, we have 4 or 5 weeks here, and to be honest, that's a pretty good amount of time compared to what we've had on other grant projects that folks are eligible for, especially with the relief money that's been available in the past. So there is time. I would encourage folks, if they're interested, if they have a great idea, or they've been working on something and they could use some funds for planning or working capital, to reach out to us right away, because we can help folks identify whether or not their project is eligible and then help them through the application process to make sure that we're making the best use of your time and that we have successful projects.
Absolutely. Yeah. The past, when you've come on the show before, we've talked about how difficult it can be to navigate kind of these grant applications and things like that. So having the help from you and others in your office, that is such a valuable resource for those that are looking to take advantage of these opportunities.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really what we're here for. We can have all the federal funding in the world, but if you can't access it, it doesn't mean anything. And of course, I'm a super, Kansas patriot, and I want to see, I want Kansas to get its share of the funds. If people are interested in learning more about this program in particular, or contacting us and, walking through your ideas, there are some great resources on our website. It's rd.usda.gov/KS. And there are folks who are a lot smarter than me who can walk you through the application process and have worked closely with these programs.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I'll link to that resource in the show notes of today's show, which, as always, can be found on agtoday.net. And Christy, I think sometimes, producers hear about these opportunities and they're like, oh, that's great, but I have this idea, but it's just something that I'll put off maybe until next time. What sort of encouragement do you have to offer to them that, now is really the time to start taking advantage of these opportunities?
Because we have more funding for these programs than we've had in the past, it's a great opportunity because we don't know that will be the case moving forward in the future. So we have the opportunity to really compete on a national level. I would say also I understand the reticence sometimes to participate in government programs, and there are lots of reasons why people wouldn't apply, and I understand that. Many of our funding programs at USDA Rural Development are financing programs, and some folks just don't want to, regardless of the great interest rate, may not want to take on additional debt. One of the advantages of this program in particular is that it's a grant, and most of our programs are loans. So there's an opportunity there. It's also, grants that can go up to $250,000, which, may make it worth doing the paperwork. We encourage folks to have a cash match that helps projects compete, but it's not absolutely required for this particular program. So in general, I think, grants can go a little farther than financing. It might be a little bit more worth filling out the paperwork if you have a project that qualifies.
some great insight there. And, you were listing some of the success stories that came about from programs like this before when we first got started here. And, I think one of the things that caught my ear is, just the diversification for those producers of outside of what they're used to doing every day and adding this on to their production element. That's value there, right?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of folks were thinking about this a long time ago, but this really came to light, I think, during COVID when people were really getting creative with production. And also, we're trying to diversify their operation. There's opportunities there. And I think also there's a trend toward, localizing production and distribution. And in the case of our rural communities, it's pretty exciting if you have a producer of a niche product that's also manufacturing that and shipping that product from their point of operation in Kansas. To me, that's really great. Folks are really interested in local products. They want to know where the food comes from. And these are opportunities to give consumers what they want, but also help Kansas producers, which in turn, of course, helps our rural communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, which of course is at the heart of everything you and your team do in the rural development in Kansas here with the USDA. So, Christy, thank you so much again for joining us today. And I'm going to have you mention that website again, just in case people are listening and they want to check out that website later on.
The website for USDA Rural Development for Kansas is rd.usda.gov/KS. And there are links there to all of our programs. There's a button that says View All Kansas Contacts. You'll find our business program staff there. That's the staff that's managing the VAPG program. Reach out to them. They're very helpful. Be patient with them. They're very busy, but we are always happy to help to walk people through the process. And again, don't hesitate to contact us and just ask if you have a project that will qualify so that we're sure if you take the time to complete the application that you're eligible and that we have an opportunity of seeing funding.
Absolutely. Well, once again, everyone, that was Christy Davis. She is the USDA Kansas State Director for Rural Development, joining us for a conversation on value-added production grants here in Kansas, again with an upcoming May deadline. So be sure to check that out if you are interested. Also, before we cut to a short break, a friendly reminder that first hollow stem updates for wheat are readily available through K-State's Agronomy e-Update. The weekly newsletter shares information on first hollow stem measurements for 21 different commonly grown wheat varieties in Kansas. The September sown replicated trials are located at the South Central Experiment Field near Hutchinson. The link to these updates can be found in today's show notes, which, as always, can be found at agtoday.net. And while these updates serve as a valuable resource, K-State Wheat and Forage Specialist Romulo Lolato encourages producers to monitor their own first hollow stem progression from ungrazed portions of each of their own individual wheat pastures. This is in order to make the best decision for removing cattle. Our conversation on wheat will continue in the coming days with wheat updates from several K-State research and extension agents from across the state. Once again, we're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we're ending this Wednesday's programming with our Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. This week, we're joined by K-State experts Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Bob Larson.
Welcome to BCI Ask the Experts. I'm Brad White. Happy to have two great experts with me today, Dr. Dustin Pendell.
Good morning, Brad.
And Dr. Bob Larson.
Hello, guys.
We're going to answer a listener question here in just a second. As always, if you have a question you'd like to send in to us, you can send it to bci@ksu.edu. And this question was relevant to hiring a manager. And what they wanted to know was, we need to find a manager for our operation. That's been a little bit challenging. What are some tools and techniques that you guys would recommend? Before you start answering, Dustin, I want to remind everybody you guys get up to 10 points for your answers. So, Dustin, you're up first.
I can see both sides of the argument, either hire or raise your own, if you will. I've always been a proponent of hiring external. And the reason is you bring somebody in that's maybe got some fresh ideas, that's not entrenched in the tradition. They might not carry all the baggage that could come with that internally. And so for me, I really like to hire external just because it's bringing fresh ideas in, and it's going to try to hopefully elevate you from where you currently are to that next level.
Okay, so bring in some of those fresh ideas and try to reinvigorate the organization maybe, and also avoid some of the bad. So 6 points for Dustin out of the gate. Bob?
I agree that I have seen cattle producers be very successful either bringing in outside people or growing their own. And I've also seen some that weren't as successful with that. But one of the real values of growing your own is developing over time some of that institutional knowledge. And, we've tried this before, what worked for us, what didn't. And I'm going to say, some of those outside ideas, I'm going to put that a lot on the owner, the manager, to be interacting with people to come up with the new ideas. And I want my employees to institute the tried and true things over and over. So I'm going to say both are important, new ideas as well as really getting your procedures down well. So I'm going to say grow your own, really help develop that, adding skills, adding experience over a fairly long time period.
So I like that because you get a little faster startup when you get going because they already know what they're doing. They already know the ins and outs of the operation. And you address Dustin's point saying we can still get those fresh ideas somewhere else. So 7 points for Bob. Dustin, I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to ask, okay, if I'm looking externally, how do I find those people? How do I cast a net to get the right people into my operation?
So that's a good question. And I think there's a lot of people right now that are casting those nets. So it's probably even more challenging at the moment. But obviously social media, trying to maybe even hire somebody like a headhunter. That is also a common in production ag as well. And so there's multiple sources. I think whether it's newspaper, whether it's Facebook, I've seen it all. Or I think maybe depending on the kind of position you need and the kind of skills you're looking for, seeking out maybe a professional company that will go out and kind of outsource that.
Yeah, but have a plan. You're going to have to be probably, as you mentioned, and what I'm hearing is be aggressive.
You've got to
Don't
be proactive.
passive.
You can't sit back in this kind of environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, Bob, I'm going to ask you a different question because you said kind of grow your own in the operation. What are some of the tools and tips that you would use in growing your own manager? How do you approach that? Or do you just say, hey, do your job and we'll figure out if you're a manager later?
That's honestly what I'm tempted to do a lot of times because I'm busy with a lot of other things. But developing your work staff, and again, in a lot of cow-calf operations, that's not particularly a large number, but they still need guidance, they need encouragement, they need clear expectations. And so one of the things is, as the business owner is carving off a fairly large amount of time focused on getting the most out of my employees. And usually that's training, feedback, expectations, and really spending a lot of time on that. It's one of those things that I think, whether it's finding a new employee, I think you almost have to be looking all the time because I'm looking for characteristics, persistence, hard work, some of the things that are harder to train. I want to be looking for that all the time. And then when I see someone within my operation that has some of those skills but maybe lacks some experience and knowledge, invest in them so that they grow some experience and knowledge because they have some of those intangible traits that are harder to find.
Excellent. So, Bob, you're going to develop them there, but it takes a fair bit of work. But I like what you said, always looking. So, Bob ends up with 9 points, Dustin with 8. Thanks for joining us today. If you have questions for us, you can send them in to bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, those were K-State experts Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Bob Larson rounding out today's show with this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.